MO was primarily initially to gain notoriety, to get attention. I think it was a power trip for him, feeling that he could just execute people and get away with it. The more the news played it out, the more he got involved, because I think he really liked feeling powerful, and he liked playing the games, which he did a lot with the police.
And
draw more media attention. I think he was very strategic in how he behaved. I think he thought it through carefully. What shall I do next?
The streets of California once bustled with peace and innocence, where the sun dipped below the horizon in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across quiet neighborhoods and busy city blocks. It was a land where families thrived, where kids played in parks and couples strolled hand in hand under the clear skies. Yet beneath this picturesque exterior, a shadow lurked, silent and unseen, waiting to alter the course of history. A shadow that would come to be known as the Zodiac Killer. The victims, they were ordinary people, living ordinary lives, people just like you and me. They were fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. They had hopes, dreams, and plans for tomorrow. And yet their names would be forever etched in the pages of history for one tragic reason. Their lives were stolen in the most horrific of ways. In the blink of an eye, they went from being someone's loved one to a symbol of a terrifying mystery. They were the faces of innocence, unaware that the world would come to know them only for their tragic end. The murders began with shocking violence, shattering the safety and tranquility of their lives. The victims' deaths left behind not just grief, but a series of cryptic clues, taunting messages, and strange symbols, all of which would serve as a chilling breadcrumb trail that led to nowhere. Who was behind this? Who was the Zodiac Killer? This question, simple in its nature, became a haunting riddle that would puzzle the authorities, the media, and an entire community for over 5 decades. It wasn't just the brutality of the murders that would remain with people. It was the audacity of the killer, who seemed to mock the very idea of justice. He sent letters to newspapers, crafted codes that no one could decipher, and taunted law enforcement with each passing day. The cryptic messages he left behind seemed to be as much a part of the crime as the murder itself. As the killings continued, the cryptograms grew more complex, and the letters more personal, making it clear that this was no ordinary criminal. This was someone who thrived on the fear they instilled in others, someone who relished in the confusion they caused. And still, despite years of investigation, countless suspects, and advances in technology, the Zodiac's true identity remains a haunting enigma. With each passing year, the mystery deepens. How could someone so cold, so calculated, elude justice for so long? Why was he never caught? The question has echoed in the minds of millions, but the answer remains as elusive as the killer himself. This is the chilling story of the Zodiac Killer, a serial killer whose cryptic messages terrorized a community, left an indelible mark on the public consciousness, and challenged the very notion of justice. As the decades have gone by, the mystery has only grown, and with each passing day, the truth remains as haunting as ever. Who was the Zodiac Killer? And will the enigma ever be solved? This tale is one that still grips the imagination, leaving behind a trail of fear and fascination that may never truly fade. The year was 1968. Northern California, a region renowned for its peaceful suburban communities, had long been a symbol of tranquility. Its landscapes were vast and stunning, rolling hills covered in wildflowers, shimmering lakes reflecting the golden sunsets, and streets lined with towering oak trees. Families thrived in this serene environment, their lives unfolding against a backdrop of calm, with the sun shining on every corner of the land. The warmth of the California weather mirrored the warmth of the people who lived there. It was a place where people believed they could raise their children in peace, without fear, without worry. But the calm was about to shatter. Something was coming, something that would forever change the course of history. It was late in the year, the kind of December night that held a chill in the air. The stars above flickered like scattered diamonds, but the evening held an undercurrent of unease. Unbeknownst to many, this would be the night that marked the beginning of an unspeakable nightmare. It was on this night that the Zodiac Killer would strike for the first time, forever etching his name into the annals of criminal history. On December 20th, 1968, 2 high school students, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, set out for what should have been a quiet evening, just two young people in love, enjoying a simple date. They had no idea that their lives, full of potential and promise, would be stolen from them in an instant. They parked their car along a quiet, isolated stretch of road, far from the safety of the town they knew so well. It was a secluded spot, perfect for a romantic evening, but within moments of sitting in the car, their world was turned upside down. Betty Lou and David's tragic end began when the killer, without warning, approached their vehicle. The details remain clear. A gunshot rang out, followed by another. The young couple, now forever frozen in time, lay in the cold, their lives snuffed out. It was a brutal and senseless murder, one that would leave a lasting mark on their families, their friends, and the community that had once thought themselves safe. But this was only the beginning of a much larger tragedy. In the weeks that followed, the community was left in shock, struggling to understand what had happened. They could not fathom how such an innocent, youthful encounter could be met with such violence. But little did they know that the Zodiac Killer was just getting started. As the investigation into the deaths of Betty Lou and David unfolded, it became clear that the killer was no ordinary murderer. This was a person who took pleasure in toying with the authorities. A few weeks after the murders, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, sent by someone claiming responsibility for the killings. The letter, written in a cryptic, taunting style, mocked the police and made reference to further murders, hinting that the killer had more victims in mind. It was the beginning of the Zodiac's notorious cryptic messages. Letters filled with ciphers, symbols, and riddles that taunted investigators and the public alike. The killer, whoever he was, made no attempt to hide his identity. In fact, he reveled in the attention, teasing authorities with every letter he sent. But his cryptic nature also became his greatest defense. No one could decode his messages, and despite all the efforts, his true identity remained hidden. He was a master at staying one step ahead, a specter in the shadows that would continue to haunt the community. And so the hunt for the Zodiac Killer began. Law enforcement was thrust into a maddening chase, one that would span decades. The letters kept coming, each one more baffling than the last. Yet despite their best efforts, the investigators couldn't close in on the killer. They had no leads, no suspects, and no idea who was behind the grotesque murders. The killer had learned how to use fear as a weapon, how to manipulate the media, and how to confuse the authorities. His arrogance was unmistakable. It was as if he enjoyed the thrill of watching them scramble for answers. And so the question remained, who was the Zodiac Killer? What drove him to commit such gruesome acts? Why did he feel the need to leave behind these cryptic puzzles, each one more maddening than the last? What was the connection between the victims, and why did he target young people in the prime of their lives? What was it that made him so elusive, so difficult to capture? The hunt for the Zodiac Killer would go on, but the chilling truth was that, for many years, the killer was never caught. His identity would remain a mystery, one that eluded even the most dedicated investigators. The ciphers and codes remained unsolved, and the public's fear grew. With each letter, with each taunting message, the killer's presence loomed larger and larger, until he became a specter, a shadow that haunted the minds of everyone who lived in Northern California. The victims, too, were not forgotten. Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday became symbols of the tragedy, forever tied to a case that remained unsolved. Their families, devastated by the loss, were left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. The deaths of these young students marked the beginning of a long and painful journey for the people of Northern California. It was a journey that would span years with no answers in sight. In the midst of all this, there were others, detectives, journalists, and ordinary citizens who would join the search for the killer. Some were driven by duty, others by the desire for justice, but all of them shared one common goal: to uncover the truth, to unmask the Zodiac Killer. But as the years wore on, the question remained unanswered, the mystery unsolved. Who was the Zodiac Killer? What made him tick? And would his true identity ever be revealed? The answers were elusive, but the search continued, fueled by the hope that one day the killer would be brought to justice. The story was far from over, and the hunt for the man behind the mask was just beginning. Betty Lou Jensen, only 16 years old, had already mapped out her dreams for the future. She was bright, energetic, and filled with the ambition that comes with youth. Her aspirations led her toward becoming a teacher, a goal she carried with a sense of purpose that fueled her every step. Betty Lou had a warmth about her, a natural charm that drew people in. Her life, still in its early stages, was filled with promise. Promises of a career in education, of finding a partner who would appreciate her dreams, and of creating a family that would be full of love. She was young, hopeful, and full of potential. Yet, that potential would never be realized, and the world would never know the woman she could have become. David Faraday, just a year older than Betty Lou, was just as full of life and potential. At 17, he was a high school student with a promising future. He was popular, an athlete, with a calm and collected demeanor that made him approachable to anyone who crossed his path. His life, like Betty Lou's, was still unfolding, filled with friendships, interests, and goals. David had plans that included graduating, perhaps going on to college, and maybe someday finding the right person to share his life with. In his brief time on Earth, he had already made a mark, but it was one that would be overshadowed by his tragic death. David and Betty Lou were more than just names. They were teenagers at the cusp of their futures, filled with possibility and hope, unaware that a killer was closing in. The Zodiac Killer, on the other hand, was a shadowy figure, someone whose background remained shrouded in mystery. We know little about his early life, but what we do know is chilling. He was a calculating individual, a master of manipulation, who would leave a trail of terror in his wake. The Zodiac's first confirmed kills pointed to a methodical and meticulous nature, each murder planned with precision, executed with chilling indifference. But what led this person down a path of such horror? Was it a childhood marred by trauma? Did personal grievances fuel this compulsion to kill, or was there a deeper psychological wound driving his actions? Some experts theorized that the Zodiac's motives were born of deep psychological disturbances, possibly stemming from early childhood trauma or an intense need for control. Whatever it was that drove him, the Zodiac seemed to approach his killings with purpose, targeting random couples, often in isolated locations, as if he knew precisely what he was doing. The randomness of his choices only added to the chilling nature of the murders. The victims seemed to be selected for no reason other than their vulnerability, their solitude, and perhaps their proximity to the twisted mind of the killer. Despite the randomness of his victim selection, there was always a signature left behind. It wasn't just the murders themselves that defined the Zodiac, it was the strange and unnerving phone calls he made to the police before each crime, the bizarre letters he sent, some of which included cryptic ciphers that made no sense to anyone trying to decode them. His letters were chilling, taunting, and laced with an arrogance that seemed to convey a sense of superiority over the authorities. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to be known. His letters were a reflection of his need for recognition, a need to challenge those who tried to track him down. But the puzzle he presented was far from solvable. His ciphers remained unsolved for years, giving him a sense of invincibility that would only grow stronger with time. The first killing was a harbinger of the violence that would come. The hills of Vallejo, California were quiet, isolated, a place where couples often sought out privacy away from prying eyes. It was on a road like this that Betty Lou and David found themselves on the night of December 20, 1968. They were simply enjoying their time together, parked in a secluded area, unaware that they were being watched. The killer, calculating and cold, approached their vehicle. He shot David first, at point-blank range, and then turned to Betty Lou. Without mercy, he fired the fatal shots, ending their lives in an instant. The Zodiac's methodical nature didn't end with the shooting. After confirming their deaths, he didn't flee in panic or confusion. No, the killer calmly walked away from the scene, leaving behind not just two victims, but a trail of fear that would haunt the entire community. He was already preparing his next move, crafting a letter to send to the local newspaper, claiming responsibility for the attack. It was the beginning of his infamous communication with the public and the authorities, a correspondence that would continue throughout his killing spree, further entwining the killer with the collective consciousness of a terrified public. The immediate aftermath of the murders sent shockwaves through the community. Vallejo, a town known for its peaceful existence, was now a place where fear took root. The idea that a murderer could strike without warning, take 2 lives, and then send taunting letters to the press was enough to make anyone uneasy. People began looking over their shoulders, wondering if they were next. The silence of the night had been shattered by violence, and the community was left scrambling to make sense of it all. The Zodiac's letters only added to the confusion and fear. He claimed responsibility for more deaths than he had actually committed, and with each new letter, his message became more cryptic, more bizarre. The police had no real leads, no solid evidence, and the ciphers left behind were impossible to crack. It was as though the killer had orchestrated a game that no one could win. The fear that spread through the town wasn't just about the murders. It was about the overwhelming feeling that justice might never be served. Who was the Zodiac Killer? And why had he chosen this quiet corner of California to begin his reign of terror? The families of Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday were left devastated, as were the families of every victim who would follow. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that the killer remained at large, taunting the very authorities that were supposed to protect them. The once tranquil community of Vallejo was now a place where the shadow of the Zodiac Killer loomed large, a reminder that peace could be shattered in an instant, and that the safety they had always known could be taken away with no warning. The emotional contrast was striking. California, a state known for its sunny disposition and peaceful way of life, now caught in the grip of fear. The ordinary, everyday lives of the residents of Vallejo had been irreparably altered, replaced by an uncertainty that would remain for years to come. The Zodiac Killer had begun his campaign, and it was clear that he wouldn't stop until he was caught, or until he chose to stop. But with each passing day, the sense of dread only grew stronger. The game was on, and the killer was always one step ahead. The discovery of the crime sent shockwaves through the small town of Vallejo. It was an ordinary night, until it was interrupted by a phone call that would forever change the course of history. A local resident, who had been driving down the quiet road where Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday had been parked, noticed something unusual. The car, which had appeared normal just moments before, was now abandoned on the side of the road. The doors were ajar and 2 bodies lay lifeless inside. The witness immediately called the police, sparking a frantic search that would lead investigators down a twisted path of uncertainty. The officers who arrived at the scene were met with a chilling sight. The 2 young victims were slumped over, their lives taken in cold blood, yet there was little evidence to help piece together what had happened. It was clear that the killer had not lingered, having fled the scene quickly and without a trace. There were no witnesses, no suspects, and no solid leads. The scene was quiet, eerily so, as if the killer had disappeared into thin air. As the investigation unfolded, law enforcement struggled to find any tangible evidence that could lead them to the killer. The area around the crime scene had been carefully scoured, but it was as though the killer had vanished without a trace. No fingerprints were found on the car, no footprints in the surrounding dirt, and no other physical evidence that could connect someone to the murders. It was as though the killer had walked into the night, leaving no sign of his presence behind. But despite the lack of evidence, investigators pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. They began to look at the possible motives behind the killings, and theorized about the kind of person who would commit such a brutal act. With little to go on, they turned to the Zodiac's cryptic letters, which had already begun to surface. The letters were a chilling reminder of the killer's presence, taunting law enforcement with every word. He had already sent a message to the local newspaper, claiming responsibility for the murders and hinting at future killings. But more than that, the Zodiac included ciphers, complex puzzles that seemed designed not only to confuse, but to challenge those who attempted to solve them. The authorities were baffled by the codes, and no one could crack them. The letters, as bizarre as they were, painted a picture of a man who relished the fear he instilled in others. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a master of psychological warfare, using the media and the public to play his twisted game. The 911 call that had been made shortly after the discovery of Betty Lou and David's bodies offered another chilling layer to the unfolding mystery. The dispatcher's voice, calm but firm, contrasted sharply with the chaos on the other end of the line. The caller, frantic and unsure, provided just enough detail to confirm the crime, but not enough to offer any real clues. The panic in the caller's voice hinted at the confusion that followed the discovery. The bodies were only the beginning. The terror had spread quickly, and with it came a sense of dread that no one in Vallejo could shake. Law enforcement scrambled to piece together the puzzle. They combed through the neighborhood, interviewed local residents, and gathered every scrap of information they could find. They spoke to those who might have seen something, anything, that could help them identify the killer. But the town was in shock, and the killer remained elusive. He had already shown his ability to strike swiftly and disappear into the night, leaving no trace behind. He was methodical, careful, and seemingly unstoppable. As the weeks passed, the investigation grew more intense. Officers from neighboring towns joined in, but still there was no break in the case. The Zodiac's cryptic messages, which had now turned into a series of increasingly bizarre letters, only deepened the mystery. The killer taunted investigators, giving them just enough to keep them engaged, but never enough to reveal his identity. It became clear that this was not just a random act of violence. The Zodiac was playing a game, and he was winning. The ciphers, which had been initially baffling, were now an obsession for the authorities. Each symbol, each cryptic word seemed to hold a clue, yet no one could crack the code. They enlisted experts, cryptographers, mathematicians, anyone who might be able to decipher the twisted messages. But each attempt to unravel the Zodiac's letters ended in frustration. The killer's ability to remain one step ahead left law enforcement grasping at straws. It wasn't just a murder investigation, it had become a battle of wits, a contest between the killer's intellect and the authorities' resolve. As months turned into years, the list of suspects grew. Detectives questioned numerous individuals, some with questionable backgrounds, others simply because they fit the profile of what the killer might be. But despite the long list of people interrogated, no one was ever arrested. The Zodiac had covered his tracks too well. He remained a shadow, a faceless figure whose identity continued to elude law enforcement. One by one, the suspects were eliminated, but the Zodiac Killer remained just that. The Zodiac Killer. An enigma, a mystery that seemed to defy explanation. He had given the authorities all the clues they needed, but they remained just out of reach. His letters grew more erratic, but his ability to hide in plain sight was unmatched. He was a ghost, moving through the world undetected, while law enforcement struggled to even get close. The case had now become an obsession, not just for the local authorities, but for the entire nation. The Zodiac had become more than a killer. He was a symbol of fear and frustration. His cryptic messages had sparked the imagination of millions, leading to countless theories, books, and documentaries. Some believed he was hiding in plain sight. Others thought he had simply disappeared, never to be heard from again. But the truth, if it was ever found, remained elusive. The Zodiac Killer had done something few criminals ever managed to do. He had become a legend. His ability to remain hidden, his cryptic messages, and the way he manipulated the public's fear made him one of the most notorious serial killers in history. And despite years of investigation, numerous theories, and endless speculation, the Zodiac Killer's true identity remained a mystery. The investigation had reached a point where it seemed as though the killer would never be caught. And yet the case was far from closed. Every new letter, every cryptic symbol, only added to the legend of the Zodiac. The killer's identity was locked away, hidden in the codes he left behind, and the answer would continue to elude those who tried to crack the case. The pursuit for the Zodiac had become a never-ending quest, a quest that would haunt law enforcement and the public for years to come. In the end, the Zodiac Killer was more than just a murderer. He was a symbol of fear, a reminder that evil can exist in the most unexpected places, and that even the best investigators may never be able to solve every mystery. His crimes, his letters, and his identity would remain unanswered, a haunting reminder that some questions may never be solved. And as the investigation faltered, the legend of the Zodiac Killer only grew stronger. The search for the Zodiac Killer seemed to move in cycles. Each new investigation into the case brought with it a wave of theories, suspects, and tantalizing clues, only to end in frustration. Despite the intense efforts of law enforcement, the public's collective imagination, and the tireless work of countless investigators, there was never a trial. The Zodiac Killer remained elusive, a figure whose identity haunted the minds of all who tried to uncover it. The courtroom, where justice might have been served, remained a distant dream, a dream that would never come to fruition. Over the years, numerous theories about the Zodiac's identity were presented, often based on the strange and cryptic letters he sent to the press. These letters, with their cryptograms and bizarre ramblings, seemed to hold a key to understanding the mind of the killer. Some theorists suggested that the Zodiac was someone close to the victims, someone who knew the area well, perhaps even a member of the community. Others believed the killer was someone who had traveled to the area specifically to commit his crimes, a drifter who used the anonymity of the cities and towns to conceal his true identity. Various profiles were proposed, some of which pointed to men with histories of violent behavior, others to those who exhibited disturbing psychological traits. Some even speculated that the Zodiac might have had military training, given his ability to remain calm, calculated, and methodical in his actions. With each new theory, the mystery seemed to grow deeper. Yet, despite all the speculation, no concrete evidence ever surfaced. The police were left with nothing more than vague suspicions and circumstantial details. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the investigation was the failure to crack the Zodiac's ciphers. The killer's cryptic messages, which he had sent to the press and law enforcement, seemed to hold the key to unlocking his identity. The ciphers were like puzzles, taunting and mocking anyone who tried to solve them. Some of the codes appeared simple, while others were highly complex, filled with seemingly random symbols and letters. Despite the best efforts of cryptographers, mathematicians, and amateur sleuths, the ciphers remained an enigma. Some were eventually deciphered, but the clues they revealed never pointed directly to the killer. They were like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that didn't fit together. The Zodiac's letters continued to arrive over the years, each one more bizarre and elusive than the last. He would often send cryptic messages, promising that more murders would follow, and taunting law enforcement for their inability to catch him. The killer seemed to delight in the fear he instilled in the public, and in the frustration he caused for those trying to solve his case. With each letter, it became clear that he was playing a game, and it was a game that no one had been able to win. As time went on, the investigation slowed, and the hunt for the Zodiac Killer faded into the background of public attention. The case grew cold, and the once vibrant discussions in newspapers and television segments dwindled. The killer, it seemed, had disappeared. The letters stopped, and the murders ceased. But even as the years passed, the mystery of the Zodiac Killer lingered in the public consciousness. No one could forget the fear that he had caused, the questions that remained unanswered, and the chilling sense that the killer was still out there, somewhere, watching. With no suspect in custody, and no solid leads, there was never a trial. The courtroom drama that could have taken place, where the killer might have been confronted with the crimes he committed, never came to be. The evidence, such as it was never strong enough to bring charges against anyone. The numerous theories that had been presented over the years remained just that, speculations with no basis in fact. Even as new potential suspects emerged, none of them could be definitively linked to the killings. Without hard evidence, the case remained open, but unresolved. The lack of a trial meant that justice was never served. The victims' families, who had lived through the horror of the murders, were left with unanswered questions, unable to find closure. The community, which had once been rocked by the brutal killings, was now left in a kind of perpetual limbo. They could only wonder what might have happened if the killer had been caught, if the trial had ever taken place, and if justice had been done. For the Zodiac Killer, there was no reckoning. He was never brought to justice, and his identity remained a mystery. The public had long moved on, but for those who lived through the terror of his reign, the unanswered questions would forever haunt them. What could have been if the killer had been caught? What could have been if the ciphers had been cracked sooner? What could have been if justice had been served? The Zodiac Killer's name would forever be synonymous with one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in criminal history. Despite all the efforts of law enforcement, the theories, and the endless speculation, the case remained open, its secrets locked away in the shadows. The killer had won. He had escaped justice, and his identity remained forever hidden behind the mask of his cryptic messages. The courtrooms of California, where a trial might have been held, remained empty. The witnesses, the victims' families, and the police officers who worked tirelessly to uncover the truth were left to wonder what could have been. The Zodiac Killer's identity remained a question mark. His reign of terror, a dark chapter in the history of law enforcement. For decades, the Zodiac Killer has been the subject of books, documentaries, and countless theories. Yet, despite all of this, his identity remains unknown. The courtroom drama that never took place is one that still lingers in the minds of those who followed the case. Could justice have been served? Could the killer have been stopped before more lives were lost? These are questions that will never be answered, and the mystery of the Zodiac Killer will continue to live on, unsolved, for as long as history remembers it. The grief of the victims' families is immeasurable, each day marked by the same sorrowful questions, the same relentless ache of not knowing. Betty Lou Jensen's parents, unable to shield their daughter from the horrors of fate, were left with nothing but memories of the girl who should have had so much more time to live. Her dream of becoming a teacher was dashed in an instant, and her absence cast a shadow on all who knew her. David Faraday's family, too, was left to cope with a tragedy they couldn't begin to comprehend. Their bright, athletic son, someone who had just begun to chart his future, was now gone, his life extinguished too soon. These families, bound together by grief, were united in their desire for answers. They lived in the limbo of an unresolved case, their pain worsened by the haunting fact that the killer remained free. The community of Vallejo, where the young couple had lived and dreamed, was forever changed. Once a quiet, peaceful town, the fear of the Zodiac Killer hung over it like a thick fog. The murders shattered the sense of safety that residents had taken for granted. The streets that had once been filled with laughter and the chatter of children now seemed eerily quiet. Neighbors looked over their shoulders, wary of strangers and even those they thought they knew. The very ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as if the foundations of their peaceful existence had been shaken to their core. Every shadow, every moment of quiet became a reminder that the killer was out there, and that anyone could be his next victim. In the years that followed, the Zodiac Killer's reign of terror became ingrained in the collective memory of Vallejo and the surrounding areas. The local community was forever marked by the brutality of the crimes and the haunting uncertainty that came with them. But it was more than just the families and the people who lived in those quiet streets who felt the impact. The entire country was watching, and as news of the killer's actions spread, so did the fear. The Zodiac Killer became more than just a murderer. He became a symbol of something much larger, a reminder that even the most peaceful communities could be shattered in an instant. As the case unfolded, the media seized upon the mystery of the Zodiac, amplifying the fear that gripped the public. Newspapers, television stations, and radio broadcasts relentlessly covered every new development, every letter, every cryptic message sent to the press. The story of the Zodiac Killer captivated the nation, and soon, it became a staple of popular culture. Books were written, documentaries produced, and films made, each one exploring the unsolved mystery of the killer's identity. The Zodiac was no longer just a name, it became a symbol of terror, a villain whose power lay in the unknown. But as time passed, the story didn't just fade into history, it morphed, taking on a life of its own. As people continued to try to unravel the mystery, online communities sprang up, dedicated to investigating the case, to cracking the ciphers, and to uncovering the identity of the killer. These digital detectives, armed with internet searches, armchair theories, and their own obsessions, continued the investigation long after law enforcement had hit dead ends. New suspects were proposed, new theories put forward, and old evidence re-examined. The case, which had remained cold for decades, sparked a wave of renewed interest and speculation. The mystery of the Zodiac Killer, it seemed, was far from over. And though many questioned the effectiveness of the investigation, the truth remained elusive, leaving an entire generation to wonder what might have been if the case had been solved sooner. This raises an important question: how did law enforcement handle the case? Looking back, there were clear failures in the investigation. The Zodiac Killer was allowed to slip through the cracks in ways that seem almost incomprehensible now. With the technological advances of today, One can only imagine how much more could have been done to catch the killer. There were moments of miscommunication, leads that went cold, and missteps in the handling of crucial evidence. But at the time, law enforcement had to contend with a murderer who seemed to be always one step ahead. The Zodiac's letters, which mocked the very idea of justice, demonstrated just how much power he had over the investigation. The ciphers remained unsolved for years, and the killer's ability to manipulate the media only added to the chaos. At its core, the case also raises broader questions about the role of early intervention and mental health in preventing violence. Could the Zodiac killer's descent into violence have been avoided with proper mental health intervention? This is a question that remains relevant, not just in this case, but in many others. It highlights a failure in the system to recognize the warning signs of someone who might be on a path to violence. Could there have been a way to stop him before he ever picked up a gun? Could his childhood trauma, whatever it may have been addressed before it led to such horrific consequences? The story of the Zodiac Killer serves as a chilling reminder of how important it is to address mental health issues and provide support before they escalate into something much more dangerous. As we look back on the story of the Zodiac Killer, we are reminded of the devastating impact one man's actions can have on an entire region. The community of Vallejo, the families of the victims, and the countless people affected by the case live with the lingering questions that will never be answered. The killer's reign of terror left an indelible mark on the region, but it also serves as a reminder of the fragility of life. No one is immune from the horror that can be unleashed in an instant. The events that unfolded in those quiet hills of Northern California were a tragic wake-up call, showing just how vulnerable we all are. But as we move forward, we must remember the victims, the lives of Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, and the others who lost their lives at the hands of the Zodiac Killer. Their stories, though marked by tragedy, remind us that there is more to them than the circumstances of their deaths. They were young, vibrant individuals with dreams and hopes for the future. They were more than just names in a case file. They were people, and their lives deserve to be remembered, not just in the context of their untimely deaths, but as the people they were before the killer ever came into their lives. In honor of the victims, we must continue to ask questions. The story of the Zodiac Killer is far from over. It is a story that will continue to haunt us, to provoke thought and discussion. But we must also remember that there are lessons to be learned from this tragedy. We must learn to be more vigilant, to listen to the warning signs, and to act before it's too late. Mental health awareness, early intervention, and community support are vital in preventing violence and offering help to those who need it before it escalates. For those who struggle with mental illness, for those who are suffering, there are resources available. There are ways to reach out, to get help before things spiral out of control. For families who are living with the impact of violence, there are support systems in place to help them heal and find peace. We cannot undo the past, but we can work together to ensure that the lessons learned from this tragedy are not forgotten. The story of the Zodiac Killer is a tragic reminder of the consequences of silence, of the toll that violence takes on communities, and of the importance of continuing to ask questions, even when the answers seem out of reach. Share this story, raise awareness, and remember the lessons of the past. Never forget those we've lost, and continue to fight for justice, for peace, and for a world where we can all feel safe.